Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to spend some time talking a little bit about data standardization before your journey to the cloud. But before we dive into that, let's go ahead and take some time for introductions. My name is Stephanie Marquez. I'm a principal supply chain consultant here at RPI, and I've been a part of this team for about 4.5 years. Throughout my tenure, I've participated in several Infor FSM CloudSuite implementations. Prior to working here at RPI, I worked in supply chain with a large healthcare system in Western New York, which is where I'm from. There, I started as a contract administrator, kind of worked my way through supply chain, ultimately filling the role of a systems application administrator before I transitioned into consulting. I almost said accounting. That was funny. I've worked in supply chain in one role or another for about the last 14 years. So throughout my various tenures at different companies, I've been in roles such as supplier, sourcing, receiving, logistics. So pretty much the whole gamut. And I'm very excited to be joined with today with Ayana Brown. I know she has a lot that she's going to share with us today. So Ayana, if you want to take a moment and introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Ayana Brown. I've been a supply chain consultant at RPI for a little over 2 years. I'm originally from New Jersey and I lived in North Carolina for 20 years and now call Southwest Florida my home. I enjoy going to the beach and traveling and filmmaking, and I volunteer every Saturday with Habitat for Humanities. I have about 20 years of Infor loss and experience. I was actually hired as a temporary employee at a healthcare system in North Carolina in 1998 to assist with their initial implementation of Lawson version 724 a long time ago. There, I worked my way up to materials manager and distribution center manager. And in all, I have approximately 17 years of experience in supply chain management in the healthcare setting before moving on to consulting.
Love it.
I also want to thank you all for joining us. And we'd love to hear a little more about you. So please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat and share where you're joining from.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's kind of take a look at our agenda. We have a lot to cover. As I mentioned at the start, we're going to be talking about supply chain management data standardization, really with an emphasis on item master, item location, vendor items. From there, we'll kind of talk a little bit about risk and impact. What does it mean to your organization? What are some things that you can be aware of as you're kind of examining this throughout your own organization? And lastly, how can we help, right? Our goal is to make sure that your data is not the weak link in your supply chain team. So let's get to it. Impact, I think of like, oh gosh, what could this impact be? When we think about the importance of data standardization, I'm curious why, from your perspective, are item master data and item location data so important? And just based on your experience, what's the overall significance there?
Well, I'm a little biased and go ahead and start by saying that. But supply chain is the backbone of any organization. The ideal situation is to have the right product available at the right time at the right price, right? So data helps you to achieve that goal. And too
Right.
often organizations are spending too much time looking for the product they need on their shelves, in their systems, or online. Descriptions are difficult to decipher, duplicates exist, and the product just needed is buried, whether it's physically or electronically, with countless items that are no longer even being used. Having clean item master and item location records can aid in a more streamlined process for users, helping them to become more efficient.
Yeah, first of all, I want to say yes to supply chain being the backbone of any organization. I also may be a little bit biased. As you mentioned, item descriptions can be very difficult to decipher. And that's been my experience as well. As I mentioned, I've worked in the healthcare space before. And when I worked for that organization, we were going through a time of like rapid acquisitions, bringing in multiple hospitals over a very short period of time, as well as a lot of offsite, non-acute care facilities. And analyzing the item master was incredibly time consuming, but I will say completely and utterly necessary. Thankfully, the team had a well-defined process for analyzing the data, because I remember the first hospital that they brought into the system had just a completely different way, a different naming convention and nomenclature for their item master items. So when that facility was brought on and live, it was a little bit of a cluster, I'll say. We did find those duplicates. You did find things like that because it wasn't standardized, and at that time it really forced the team into a cleanup project. That way they made sure that any other facilities that followed really had taken the time ahead of time to do that thorough analysis and didn't suffer the same operational impacts that we find with quote dirty data as they had previously experienced. So I'm all too familiar with that.
But at least they learned their lesson, right?
Yeah.
Because who has the time or bandwidth to do both at the same time? So making a priority is important.
Absolutely. So I want to talk a little bit about our data when we're thinking in terms of migrating from earlier forms of Lawson into CloudSuite. And I know you have a lot of experience that's relatable to that. So I really would like to hear your approach for, how you work with your clients to test it out and how you help them come to the realization that maybe their data is not as clean as they had expected.
Right. Well, for my projects, I like to use the client's data from the very first load, which is pretty early on in the project, usually right before super user training. And that
Mhm.
helps them visualize their business practices as we start design. That also gives me an opportunity to see if we're going to experience any data issues if we're, say, going live tomorrow.
Right.
Doing the load with the client tends to be an eye-opening experience when they see just how interconnected data is within CloudSuite.
Yeah.
There's a hierarchy for building CloudSuite. For example, a unit measure must exist to add it to the item, right? The item must exist to add it to the item location, and that item location must exist to add it to a par location. So you can't just load a par location file with items that don't exist in the replenish from item location or with unit of measures not associated with that item. Now,
Right.
I know that that's a mouthful, but basically, just about everything is interconnected in CloudSuite.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you did a good job in a very short amount of time just to show us how daisy chained all that data is back to the item master. You said something that kind of got me perked up a little bit, and I'm thinking maybe there's a story behind it. You said eye-opening experience. So I'm curious if it's your eye-opening experience or something that you've encountered with a client in the past where they've had an eye-opening experience.
Well, this isn't, no client is unique in this area. I will say that most of them have the same experience. So we kind of expect it, but it's good for the
Right.
client to have that eye-opening experience, right? So one client thought that it was going to be sufficient to just do a data dump of their current system to load it into CloudSuite. They quickly learned that the data had to be evaluated first after they pulled it before you can actually load it into CloudSuite. There were so many errors related to items existing in other business classes and just inconsistent information.
Yeah, and I think that that's true as far as, having to evaluate that both for clients who may be brand new to Infor or clients who have been on Infor for, 25 years. I don't think it matters that, like you said, it's not a unique experience or example. All clients really kind of go through that. It sounds like they have had some lessons learned and maybe subsequent data loads were a little bit better.
Uh, let's just say, let's just say eventually. They kept pushing off cleaning up the data with each load out, it did get better. The data was cleaner, but they still went live with bad data because they just didn't make the cleanup a priority. In the
Yeah.
end, they had to spend significant time and resources to attempt to clean the data after go live, which is not ideal.
Yeah, and that kind of is nice. Speaking of not ideal, it kind of really is a nice transition into kind of what our risks might be. We've talked a little bit about impact to data cleanup and standardization. You identified a naming convention being one right off the top that helps to have just cleaner day-to-day operations, right? While setting themselves clients really up for success for their cloud suite implementations. But we all know, as with anything we do, that there's risks. So when I think of risk, I think of the risk of doing something, but also I think in this case, the risk of not doing something or of doing nothing, right?
Right. Now, we've all heard that saying garbage in, garbage out, right? But so let's just use buying a house as an An analogy. Love that word. There are two types of people in this world. Those who pack up the old house, throwing everything into boxes and moving it all into their new house. Then they take forever to unpack the boxes first off. And then they're rummaging through them occasionally when they need something. It was probably a lot faster to pack everything up, right? But so much chaos and clutter once they're in their new house.
Right.
Then there are those who invest the time to go through those items as they pack, donating items they don't need or use, throwing away items that they can't be used, labeling the boxes for the rooms that, where the items are going to eventually live, and then moving only what survived the purge to the new house. Now, the packing process probably took a lot longer, right? But unpacking is easy and the stress of finding things is minimized once in the new house. And the new house is beautiful and well organized.
Yeah.
So why would anyone want to bring a brand new system to their organization and fill it with junk? Implementations are stressful enough, having to learn a new system, train your entire organization, and deal with change management. Why not minimize that stress level by investing in cleaning up the old system first? Additionally, as we said, CloudSuite is just not going to allow you to load conflicts, right? Therefore, the go live and subsequent downtime can be longer than necessary as we try to clean up that data as the load errors occur.
Yeah.
Remember, there's a hierarchy to loading. You shouldn't and can't really move on to the next load until the prerequisite load is complete and error-free. Many clients think that they would just clean up the data later. Cleaning up data after transactions exist is very difficult. And quite
Yeah.
frankly, is a pain that no one wants to deal with and no one seems to have time to deal with it. It leads to frustration on every level throughout the organization.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I love that analogy because I actually moved a couple of years ago and I was in my previous house for 16 years. So saying that, kind of really broke it down for me. And I did. And really what you're describing is taking the time up front, right, to go through, purge what you don't need, clean up, what needs to be cleaned up. And you're really reaping the reward and the benefits after the fact. As you
Right.
mentioned, it's like you have this downtime for go lives or clients are getting a brand new system. We want to help make their lives easier in the future. They go into these projects wanting that same outcome and their processes to be more robust. And I think, something you said, it leads to frustration on every level throughout the organization. And I think that sometimes that can often be overlooked as far as what's that downstream impact. Thank you for sharing that because you've done an amazing job at really highlighting through your own experience what those downstream impacts could be. I also kind of want to articulate, and it's funny that I kind of had like a Freudian slip saying I worked in finance because I've never worked in finance, but we often see those downstream impacts to finance as well. There's so much that's collaborative between supply chain and finance. If an item is broken, let's say, right, or the data is bad, there's times, like you said, once it's on a transaction, it's very difficult to fix. It's a matter of getting down just the right timing of where that transaction lives within the system to correct it. And oftentimes, people in finance, whether they're trying to match an invoice or get something paid, or a buyer's trying to resolve a buyer message or something like that, it can just, like you said, it kind of creates this havoc, a little bit of unnecessary chaos because it can be addressed up front. And we don't want any invoice errors or issues that may delay payments out to our vendors. We want to keep all the processes smooth.
Or to our patients. The data is often
Yeah.
transferred to our EMR for patient charges too, right?
Yeah.
So we've talked in general terms about the need for clean data ahead of a CloudSuite implementation, but I'd like to briefly highlight some specific examples that should be considered.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about the item master, for example. Are you consistently using ANSI standard for units of measure? For instance, ANSI standard for case is CA and for cassette is CS, but a lot of organizations use CA and CS interchangeably.
Yeah.
Are there discontinued items in the item master? Do you really want to bring over 10,000 items into CloudSuite when the vendors don't even recognize 1,000 of those items? Or you haven't even ordered them in the last couple of years? Are there duplicate items? Did you acquire an organization, right? Your example, It brought over, but did you bring over all of their items without even first checking to see if you already had in your item master?
Yep.
Or without first checking their purchase history to see if they've ordered in the past couple of years? And do you have established rules for your item descriptions? Do you consistently use cath for catheter? Do you consistently place the primary noun as the first word in the description? You know, there's a couple of things to consider there for item master. And then for item location, do you have locations that stock items at different unit of measures? Do you have, for instance, a distribution center that transacts at a higher unit of measure than other locations? Do you have bin locations defined for all of your items? If you have items in multiple bin locations, do you have those additional locations documented? And again, after reviewing your item master and you decide to inactivate items, you have to remove those from the item location as well. And then there are PAR locations. Have you run a utilization report to determine which items should be removed from the PARs? If an item hasn't been replenished in over a year, does it really need to be on the PAR? Now, I know this one is a tough one because nurses often want things on their PAR just in case, but this is still worth exploring. If they remove items that don't move, they will have more space for items that they may need to increase or add to the PAR.
Yeah.
Which brings me to my next point. Have you run a department usage report to determine if additional items should be added to the PAR? If units are frequently placing orders to subsidize their PAR replenishment, it may be time to adjust the PARs. And again, with the inactive items, if you've inactivated items, those items are going to have to be removed from the PAR. And do your PAR items have unique bins? Now, this may not be required for your current system, but it is definitely required for Infor. So, you know, actually, frankly, PAR items, they should have bins. People see it as we don't really need those bins, but if PAR items have bins assigned to them, it makes it easier for PAR techs to find product in the unfortunate event that does occur, that they have to count the PARs manually. Like if their handheld devices stop working, right? So having those bins in there, you can sort it by bin location. They can count it on paper if necessary. So really that's the purpose of having that bin in there, but it is required to have a unique bin in CloudSuite.
Yeah, and earlier you kind of went through and shared with us how items are just so interconnected, and that even is applicable for vendor items, right? So if you're thinking about, for my organization, you know, how can I start? This really is the order of operation that you can start in. And so as far as vendor items are concerned, kind of asking yourself or doing the same type of research is similar to the others. Have you reviewed purchase history to identify what vendor items are no longer needed? You know, have you been able to keep your vendor item file up to date with vendor changes? That's a huge one that we see all the time, is, you know, multiple different vendor items in the vendor file. And as you mentioned earlier, you can't bring in those conflicts. The system just won't have it. And so it creates a lot of ad hoc cleanup, or, you know, transactional cleanup. I mean, I think we've made that pretty clear. But, and also, again, going back to the inactive items. So if you've decided to inactivate those items from the item master, those corresponding vendor items should also be removed. You know, if you're a current Lawson user, you may be familiar with the replace and inactivate function as it pertains to the vendor items. That still exists in CloudSuite. To me, it's actually a little bit smoother of a process, but definitely something that I would encourage folks to take some time and really kind of dissect. And then in addition to that, we talk about vendor agreements or contracts, right? Like what percentage of your item master is on contract? Really kind of take a look at that. And, you know, we've got another webinar coming up, and we're going to go into a little bit more detail on that topic. But I think this really right here is really kind of the roadmap to help outline what are the things that you need to be considering, what is it that you need to be asking yourself and your team, right, to help get you in the right position for that data standardization. So what can we do to help?
Well, I'm glad you asked. Well, with the reduction in healthcare budgets and many organizations being in the red for the first time ever, many organizations don't believe that they have the funds to partner with an organization like RPI to assist with this type of cleanup. But I argue that organizations really can't afford not to. For
Mhm.
one, staff are already trying to complete their day-to-day tasks. They do not
Yeah.
have the time or bandwidth to do this type of work in addition to their normal tasks. And secondly, the risk of not doing this work before go live will almost guarantee a delay in go live, costing the organization more financially and emotionally for their staff. And
Emotionally, I like
lastly,
that.
it's a fact.
Yeah.
Stress is a real thing, guys.
Yep.
And lastly, going live with bad data will require cleanup post live. That will require additional resources. So I encourage organizations to invest in cleaning up before the project to ensure successful implementation that is on time, on budget, and minimizes the inevitable stress.
Yeah.
Now, we can partner with their teams to analyze their current data by viewing their transaction and purchase history to make recommendations for the vendor items, item master, item locations, and pro locations. But their team will obviously make the final decision on the changes, but the grunt work is done for them.
Yeah. Yeah. The time consuming piece of it. So I know we've got some time, and I wanted to really kind of give us an opportunity to address just common questions that we get when we're engaged in projects like this, or when we're doing some implementation projects with clients. So let's do a little Q&A.
Okay. Well, Steph, I will start with you, if that's okay.
Go
So
for it.
some item masters can be 50, they can have like 50 to 100,000 items, which we can expect to be a pretty significant lift, right? So how
Yeah.
would you approach this type of cleanup? And in your experience, what type of level of effort are we talking?
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. The organization that I came from in healthcare at the time, and I transitioned into consulting in 2019, we had almost 90,000 items in our item master, and they've brought on like three more hospitals since then. So I'd say it's definitely a pretty significant level of effort, but of course, it's going to depend on the organization and how large the item master is. But let's be clear, we're not just talking about cleaning up the item master, right? We've already addressed how items really are daisy chained or interconnected, and really the item master is just the foundation. So we know that items reside in several other places. We've talked about locations, we've talked about vendor items, we've talked about contract lines. So really, from my recommendation would be all of these need to be considered and included in your cleanup efforts. You can't just start at the end and work your way back or bounce around. You have to really start at the beginning. I also want to stress that this type of cleanup has to be a collaborative effort. So what I mean by that is you may have your team may be structured a little bit differently. Like you may have folks that just strictly deal with your inventory items. Then you may have folks that just deal with your non-stock, or folks that just kind of manage or maintain your contracts. Let's just assume that your organization, you want to get cracking, you want to do this cleanup, and you enlist the help of a third party such as RPI. But it's not something that can be done in a silo. And you mentioned this. It really has to be the team making those final decisions. And just kind of a brief story. When I worked in this healthcare organization, we had this exact project, and we did not have the bandwidth, and we did enlist a third party to help us with this. It was not RPI, but uh, nonetheless, it was a third party. We had, a subject matter expert from kind of each of those areas: inventory, contracting, to help with the vendor items, things like that. And we had been working, reviewing their analysis that they provided. So kind of that grunt work that you've described. And our team was responsible for kind of giving the yes or no, and then making those changes in our production environment. One day, we had an issue that was reported from an end user to a buyer. They were trying to requisition something, and it just kept airing out on them, and it was specific to vendor items. Well, it had turned out that there was just some cross communication, and that third party was, going through. They had done their analysis. We hadn't quite reviewed it in the detail that we had wanted to, and they went ahead and made updates before we had that opportunity to review and really kind of say yes or no. Long and short, it was fine. We caught it early enough. It wasn't a huge impact to the day-to-day operation at that time, but it really just emphasized how collaborative a project like this is. Again, that's whether you enlist a third-party resource to help, or you do it internally. You have to talk to one
Right.
another. So it may require conversations with finance. Hey, finance, I'm doing some data cleanup. So if you have a matching issue or the system's not letting you, it's because I'm trying to clean it up. So those conversations just have to be
I
had.
completely agree.
So I have a question for you. And we talked about how, kind of timing, and our recommendation is to really address this type of data standardization ahead of a big project. But let's be honest, it may not be realistic for organizations to address it prior to their implementation projects. As you mentioned, resources playing a huge significant role in that. So what has your experience been like with your clients, and even when you were working in the healthcare space? Can this be done, this type of standardization, cleanup efforts, analysis, things like that, can that be done in conjunction with a CloudSuite system implementation?
Look, well, technically, yes. You still have to, excuse me, you still have to throw additional resources at it, but
Yeah.
it's technically, yes, it is possible to do it at the same time as part of this implementation. But clients have to understand that this will likely be an additional expense because the project team only has a certain number of hours for that actual project, right?
Mm,
And I would encourage organizations to complete this cleanup early on in the project as possible to ensure it's complete and validated well before go live. I
yeah.
would say before system integrated testing. Also, it's important to note that if the client enlists the services of another organization to support their data cleanup efforts, RPI, if we're doing your implementation, can't be held responsible for the accuracy of that data. And actually, like you said, it's really the organization's responsibility to validate that data, whether RPI provides the cleanup recommendations or any other organization, including doing the work themselves.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's not just a like sit down, let's do it, and that's that. We're not looking at it once, the clients aren't looking at it once. It's an ongoing effort. But I definitely agree with you. I would say early on in the project, and I like your kind of system integrated testing being that milestone, because then there's still enough time left in the project to work out any kinks that there might be pertaining to that standardization or cleanup. So that's a really good point. I appreciate that insight. So let's kind of bring it home. We've covered a ton today, and really great content in regards to data cleanup and standardization, as well as what organizations can do now, right, before CloudSuite implementation. That's just going to help position them for success in the future. You shared with us, and we kind of talked about some of the impacts and risks, with an emphasis on that item master being our foundational kind of data set, but also item location, PARs, vendor items, etc. Um, Ayana, I want to thank you for sharing your experience and insight with us. It's been fun doing this with you. We don't often have the opportunity to collaborate, and so this has been a great experience for me, and I appreciate your time that it took in preparing for today's webinar.
Of
I
course.
also want to just encourage everyone to kind of stay tuned for our final installment of this CloudSuite preparation series, where Ayana and I will focus on and discuss the essential task of deleting outdated data or irrelevant orphan data and old transactional records. So please join us to learn how a proactive strategy can reduce the complexity of your data conversions or your data migrations, and really ensure that your implementation project starts off on the right foot. So thank you again for your time. We appreciate it.